Thanks for joining me here this morning. My name is Nate Schutta. I'm an architect and advocate here at Pivotal. And so I'm going to talk to you guys a bit about what does it mean to think architecturally. If you're interested in this, and I'm kind of guessing you are, otherwise you wouldn't be spending time with me, there is an ebook companion that goes along with this presentation. And rumor has it there's dead tree versions of this floating around here this week. I have yet to see one in person. I actually ordered some for an event, and they helpfully showed up 3 days after the event, so I still haven't seen one in the flesh, so to speak, myself, but I'm hoping to get my hands on one before I leave here this week. Now, I've done this architecting thing for a while, and there was a really interesting sort of perception mismatch I had from when I was a young developer thinking how cool it would be to be an architect, and then actually becoming an architect and realizing that now I've got to deal with all the competing agendas and the politics, and there's all this soft skill stuff that I need to be good at. It's not just about the technology. And of course, the other interesting component to being in any kind of technology leadership position is we realize that technology is going to change. Right, now that's not a shock to any of you. This is not something that's a surprise. I mean, you figure this out after about your second month in technology, that there's going to always be something new. You know, I remember early on in my career, I missed some wave or another. It doesn't matter which one it was, and I felt really bad because I'm like, that was my one chance to get in on the ground floor of a new technology. And of course, what I realized about a year or two later is, you know, new technologies are like a bus. You know, another one just comes along 15 minutes later, so it's okay if you miss one every so often. And this is just a constant thing. And now I would argue that this is a feature, not a bug. It's a lot of what I love about this industry is the fact that there's always new things to be exploring. There's always new things to be playing with, and it never really gets boring. You know, we're always got new toys, new shiny things that we need to figure out where they fit, where they don't. And of course, as architects, as senior tech leads, as principal engineers, whatever your title happens to be, you also have this healthy fear of avoiding legacy platforms. We never want to be in that situation where we're on something where we can't attract or retain talent, or it's just not something we want to work on because it's really old and, you know, that's just not very fun or interesting anymore. But we have to balance that against the reality that I can't just change technology every few months because I feel like it. You know, we've got to deliver business value, and the way we do that's by getting code to production, and I can't do that if I'm constantly experimenting, constantly doing proof of concepts. And if we're not careful, we end up where one of my students was, she was in one of my sessions, and she said, you know, my application has 4 separate UI frameworks in it now. And she had the same reaction. She's like, we don't like this. This is not a good place to be. And I completely understand how they got there. Because developers just kept chasing the new thing. You know, I'm sure somebody's like, oh, hey, I heard about Angular. I want to use Angular. And so they put it in their part of the application. And somebody's like, well, I heard about React. And so they started using React. And the next thing you know, you've got, you know, 4 different frameworks baked in there because nobody felt empowered to say no. Everybody just wanted to play with something new. And so we need to avoid that. And so a huge part of our job, quite frankly, boils down to how do you evaluate a new technology? How do you know what makes sense for you to use on an application? Now, I would love to tell you that I have a crystal ball and I can tell you what's going to come next, but I can't. And if anybody says I can accurately predict this is the technology we're all going to be using in 2 or 3 years, this is the JavaScript framework we're all going to loathe in 2 or 3 years, no one does. By the way, if you can accurately predict the future, I would like to have a conversation with you, but not about technology. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on the stock market and perhaps the outcome of certain sporting events. You know, I think we can use your abilities for far more profitable value than just trying to predict the technology. Now, there is one thing I feel very confident in. Whatever comes in the future is going to be different than today. And I'm extremely confident that 5 years from now, we're going to be doing something that we're not even thinking about now, that's not even on our radar screens. I mean, just think about the kind of things you were doing 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago and compare that to the kind of apps you're building now and the way you're building those applications. So we have to watch out for this. It's so tempting in our industry, and it's an important part of industry to be chasing what's coming down the pipe and just, you know, realizing that, of course, technology is going to change. This is just a constant. There's nothing you can do to stop that. And so it's very tempting for us to say, I want to chase that. I want to always be part of whatever the new thing is. I want to be on the bleeding edge. Now, I do think this is somewhat ironic because it's right there in the title. I mean, it's bleeding edge. It implies you will bleed, and yet so many of us are like, that's where I want to be with our critical, mission-critical business application that's, you know, going to be worth billions of dollars. And I understand why, because it's fun, and it's an important part of being in this industry. If you can't learn new things, this is a brutal place to be. And I would argue in my career, I think it's a single-digit number of developers I've worked with that truly struggled learning new things. And I honestly think for the few people that pop up in my head, it was a deliberate choice. They'd kind of gotten to that point where they're like, I'm done. I'm just tired of having to learn yet another new thing. Now, what's fascinating about this is our understanding evolves over time. And I ran into this great Twitter thread about it. And so Ben Evans says, there's things that you understand well enough to have a strong opinion on, and there's things where you just know what other people's opinions are, and there's other things where you just have no opinion at all. And of course, things are constantly moving in and out of those categories. I used to do a lot of front-end development, and so I had a lot of very strong opinions on JavaScript frameworks. I honestly haven't done that much front-end work now in probably 3 or 4 years. I just don't know what the status quo is anymore. I have some opinions, but I'm probably not the right person to tell you which framework is the right choice for you. And the other part of this that's so fascinating is there's always things that we're just starting to play with. There's things that you were an expert on in the past, but you haven't used recently. I did a lot of jQuery back in the day. I couldn't even tell you the last time I wrote any jQuery, and so it's like, my knowledge there has dwindled. And there's these things that you were an expert on, but you haven't done in years. And that's part of being in this industry is we're kind of constantly throwing away this knowledge and rebuilding it and throwing it away and rebuilding it, rinse, repeat. But now let's be brutally honest. As developers, there's a pretty good chance you have opinions, and they're probably very strongly held opinions. And like tabs versus spaces. Anybody want to have that debate today? I'm sure many of you have seen that Silicon Valley episode where they get in that fight over that and they break up over tabs versus spaces. When that episode happened, I almost fell off the couch. I thought that was just so hilarious. And my wife didn't quite understand why it was funny. And she's a business analyst, so she likes to joke that her job is to tell me what to do. And there's a lot of truth in that. But I explained it to her, and it got no funnier for her, right? And that's when you kind of go, God, all right, well, that's our industry. Now, the other side of this that's fascinating is we have a tendency to fear the old. And at some point in your career, somebody has either beaten this into your head or casually mentioned that, hey, you don't want to have a legacy skill set. You don't want to be the last of the developers. Although, ironically enough, you can make a pretty good chunk of change on the back end of a technology as long as you know when to jump. So I worked with this guy very early on in my career who already had the retirement countdown calculator going. So that was his screensaver. And so I wasn't surprised when that thing hit 0 and we had his Bon Voyage party. But I was a little surprised when I ran into him in the hallway about 9 months later. And I'm like, oh, hey, Dick, did you come in to have lunch with somebody today? He said, oh, no, Nate, I'm working now again. I'm like, oh, really? Well, that's kind of interesting. He says, yeah, I'm working 3 days a week, and they're paying me more than when I was a full-time guy. I said, that's great, you jackass. But he had the right skill set. He knew IMS, he knew DB2, he knew COBOL, he knew Telon, he knew all that stuff. And he also, of course, knew where all the skeletons were buried. Now granted, he put most of them there, but he was able to take what was truly a legacy skill set and roll it into a really nice contract. So I think sometimes that's what it boils down to, is we fear the old. And we always think the old is arcane and complex and crufty, but the new is so elegant and simple. And it's not always that way, though, is it? I mean, let's be honest. A lot of times the new stuff has a ways to go, doesn't it? Now, the other side of this equation, and I've seen this time and time again, you can insert any technology you want here, but my colleague Cote actually posted this tweet, and I was so happy because I immediately stole it and put it in this deck. And so the way he phrased this is, you know what, at first, new technology comes out, and we're like, oh my God, this is amazing. And a little while later, we're like, whew, God, this is actually pretty hard to use, right? And a little while later, actually, you should never use this technology, especially if you're just trying to put a web front end on a relational database. And then, hey, look, something shiny and new. I've seen this again and again and again and again. The only thing I would quibble with in Cote's tweet is it's not measured in years. It's probably measured in weeks or months. Now, the challenge for us, quite frankly, is where should we not use a new technology? It's so easy to say we should because something comes out and we're like, oh my God, that's amazing. And a lot of what it boils down to is trial and error. As we sit here in this room, you realize that a lot of architectural work and engineering work went into, okay, to have this much open space, we need such and such a wall, and it needs to be so high, and that means we need to use this kind of material. And we've figured that out over millennia of building buildings. And I'm fairly confident the first few buildings we built as a species didn't work out very well. There were probably some integration errors. You know, things collapsed. You know, we figured out that's not a good material to use, but this one is. And the other thing you got to keep in mind is think about the materials that were used to build this conference center we're in here this week. These are known materials that we've worked with probably for thousands of years. I mean, concrete is not a new thing. And then look at our industry. How long have we been building software? A human generation, essentially. And about every 3 months, our materials change. And so it's really hard for us to figure out, hey, where should we not use this? And so in most cases, the only way we figure it out is, well, let's try using Mongo here and see what happens. Oh, it lost my data. Not to pick on Mongo, but I feel obligated to make that statement since that's what I hear out of Josh all the time. So I'll go ahead and throw that out there. Now, the best way I can explain how we do this, ironically enough, is a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. So my son discovered Calvin and Hobbes about 4 or 5 years ago, which is fantastic because it means every night I'm home, he's like, Dad, read me some Calvin and Hobbes. And so we'll go through some. So at this point, I think I've read every Calvin and Hobbes strip 30 or 40 times. And so I ran into one, and I'm like, my God, I didn't know Bill Watterson was actually a software engineer. And so it's this one, and it's one of my all-time favorites. It says, you know, Dad, how do they know the load limit on a bridge? Well, they just drive heavier and heavier trucks over the bridge till the bridge falls down. They weigh the last truck, rebuild the bridge. I thought, that's what we do. Will this scale up to 100,000 users? I don't know. Let's throw 100,000 users and see. Oh, no, it didn't work. Oops. Bummer. Now, of course, the other side of this for us is, as developers, we have a tendency to get bored fairly quickly. And I don't know if this industry sort of brings that characteristic out of us or if that industry sort of attracts that characteristic, but we are kind of like dogs chasing squirrels, right? It's like new technology. Ooh, let's go play with that. Ooh, another one. Blockchain, you know, and we just do that. And I get it. And let's be honest, this is what keeps this industry fun. You know, I've got a friend of mine who's a bit older than me, a good golf buddy of mine. And for the last few years, he's like, you know, Nate, when I was about your age, that's when I got into management. Don't you think it's time for you to get into management? And I'm like, I don't think so. And he's like, well, you know, when I was your age, I could do my job in my sleep, and it was boring. And then I got into management, and I could, you know, build a team, and I could, you know, be a force multiplier. And don't you think that's where you're at in your career? And I'm like, you know, John, the difference is I've never felt like I could do my job cold because it's always changing. There's always something new. Now, in fairness, a lot of times we're simply renaming something we did in the past, or we're refining something we did in the past. I mean, let's look at the cloud, right? We're all very excited about the cloud, which gives us this giant pile of compute that I dole out to you, and I charge you for what you use. Does that sound like any technology we've had in the past? Yeah, a few of you are shaking your head. Yeah, it's called the mainframe. Yeah, it's conceptually very similar. I have this big pile of compute, and I'm going to sell it to you at a price for what you use. Now, obviously, very different implementation details, but conceptually the same thing, and we have a tendency to do that in this industry. Now, as I said earlier, the challenge for us is we've eventually got to deliver business value, and I can't do that if I'm constantly experimenting. Eventually, we have to commit. Say, yes, we're going to use this framework, we're going to use this stack. We're going to get good at that. And I will remind you again that the bleeding edge implies you will bleed. It's right there. This is transparency. I saw this tweet and I thought, you know, this is where all of us have been at some point. You know, hey, thank you for the wonderful new version of your program with all these shiny new features. Breaking all my old code that worked will give me many hours of enjoyment as I seek to figure out what you broke. This is why a lot of us don't upgrade sometimes, because it's just too painful. You know, there's that old adage, how do you know who the pioneers are? They're the ones with the arrows in their back. And so as architects, tech leads, principal engineers, whatever your title happens to be, we have to be strategic. We can't just flit from one technology to another like a frickin' hummingbird. And of course, we have to avoid dead platforms, but we can't constantly change direction, so we have to be strategic. Now, many organizations employ the hope strategy. And I hate to say it, but hope is not, in fact, a strategy. The only nice thing I can say about hope is it's what rebellions are built on. So we got that going for us. Yeah, you guys got the reference, thank you. We need to be deliberate. This is the hard part for us, because let's be honest, there is no shortage of things we could be playing with. I mean, just look at an event like this. I don't know, I haven't counted how many talks we have, but unless you've got one of those cool time turner things, there's a limit to how many talks you can see this week. Right? There's a lot of great ideas that are on in these other talks that you can't be in simultaneously unless you've got some superpowers. There's always new languages, there's always new techniques, there's always new approaches, and so the challenge for us is how the heck do you keep up with that? You know, you've all got your own techniques. You know, maybe you follow a bunch of people on Twitter, you know, you read books, you go to listen to podcasts, you guys are spending time with us, we appreciate that. But this stuff is just this constant stream. Very early in my career, I was talking to one of my managers, and I asked her one day, I said, you know, why did you decide to get out of technology? Why did you decide to become a manager? And she said, well, I get tired of being on the technology merry-go-round. I get tired of having to constantly learn new things. And I will admit, I was slightly taken aback by that because I'm like, so there's like nothing new to learn how to manage people? There's not like how to motivate and how to grow staff? I mean, I assume there's parallel conferences to an event like ours. But the challenge for us is that we have to develop a routine. This has to be a habit. And so you've got to figure out where can you fit this into your life. And you know, maybe it's Friday afternoon. Friday afternoon is usually a dead spot in a lot of calendars, let's be honest. I'm very much of the opinion that a late Friday meeting is a hostile act. And so hopefully you've got some time there, but maybe that's not the right spot. Maybe you're trying to get out of the office, you know, get home for the weekend, get off to the cabin, the lake, whatever it is. You know, but maybe it's Tuesday over lunch, you know, whatever fits with your calendar. I'm a huge fan of what I call morning coffee. And I've done this throughout my career. And basically what it boils down to is I take that first 15 to 30 minutes in the morning with that literal first cup of coffee, and I use that as my time to kind of peruse what's going on, what's new, what's interesting. And so you do that in the morning because if you wait, your day will be gone. I mean, how many times have you had that experience? You come in the morning, you're like, okay, today I'm going to work on this and this. And at the end of the day, you're like, I didn't even look at those things, but I was super busy all day. And I have no idea what I did, but it wasn't the stuff I wanted to do. So if you wait, it's never going to happen. So you've got to do it before the day gets away from you. And what I want you to understand, if you take nothing out of what I say here this morning, I hope it's this. Your attention is a precious resource. It is a finite resource. You don't have that much of it. Spend it wisely. There's a great quote from Seth Godin on this. He said, you know, attention's like real estate. They're not making any more of it. The big difference is the value of your attention keeps going up. I mean, just think about how many billion-dollar corporations exist to attract and monetize your attention. I mean, those cat videos are not going to watch themselves. So please do not waste your attention. By definition, you need to be selective. I hate to say this to you, but you cannot actually read it all. There was a point in time in human history where you actually could have read everything because there were only a couple hundred books. We do not, in fact, live in that point in history. There will be more things produced today than you could probably read in your lifetime. You know, so you're going to miss a lot. Now, this used to worry me because I'm like, but I'll miss something interesting. And then as I've gotten older and wiser, I realize if it's really a big deal, you will hear about it, even if you are trying not to. All right, and you know, you use whatever example you want, but I guarantee there's something that you don't normally follow that it still bubbles up at some point. You're probably aware that Apple came out with a new phone recently, right? You know, these are the kind of things that tend to get your attention one way or the other. Now, the challenge for us as technology people is I can't actually adopt everything, but I need to make some judgments about where should I invest my time? Where should we dig deeper and figure this stuff out? So there was an article that Paul Graham wrote many years ago called The Hacker's Radar, where he laid out a series of things that he was looking at and things that he used to kind of evaluate things to kind of make a decision, is this worth my time or not? And he actually wrote it about Java. And at the end of the article, he said, I have a hunch that Java won't be a very successful language. Anyone want to argue he was correct? I mean, I basically made a career out of writing Java. You know, now obviously with the value of hindsight, we can look at this and say, well, that's a pretty absurd statement. In fairness, at the time he wrote this, I can see where he may have gotten to that conclusion. But he did at least admit, you know what, I've never actually written a line of Java, and you know, I've glanced at some books, and that tells me all I need to know. So we probably need more than just a hunch. That might not be sufficient. I will admit that judging covers can be a useful filter sometimes, especially with experience. You start to see how the patterns repeat themselves, and you're like, oh no, I've seen that movie before, I know how it ends, I'm going to skip that one. You also, with experience, start to realize, oh, that's just like this, but now we can do this other thing, which is going to make that actually work. It failed in the past, but it's going to work now because of this, this, and this. Now, the most important part of this, of course, is being very aware of your bias. So I'm going to use JavaScript as my example here. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the vast majority of us have had at least one negative experience with JavaScript, say 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or earlier this week. And so we have this tendency to sort of paint JavaScript with this broad brush. And if we're not careful, we lose out on the fact that the language is evolving quite radically. If you look at some of the really interesting things that are in, JavaScript.next, it's pretty impressive. It's borrowing a lot of very good, interesting ideas from a number of languages. Right, so we have to watch out for the bias, and we have to make sure that we're not looking at this with sort of jaded eyes. We need to understand the community, what's kind of happening there. Is there a community around this thing? Is it thriving? That's really the most important part of this. But of course, we have to watch out for the lemming effect. I've seen that too often. Oh, we all have to run after this. Why? Well, I don't know. That's where everyone else is going. Is that a good idea or not? It is, by the way, if you're trying to figure out where lunch is, but not necessarily the right way to make a technology choice. We have to be careful that we're not skating to where the puck was. That's always dangerous. I've seen that often where people are like, we have to do this, well, because that's the order of things. Like, no, you can skip steps. It's okay. This isn't a chemistry experiment. Now, I'm a big fan of the technology radar. This is an artifact that comes out of ThoughtWorks a couple times a year. And it basically distills up work that's been done across hundreds of projects across the world. And hey, this is what worked, this is what didn't. I really appreciate the radar concept of, hey, these things are still either really new or really old, just hold off, all the way down to, yeah, and of course you should be using this. We recommend it without reservation. Now, I do miss the whole concept of 20% time. I really wish this had taken hold and kind of taken off, because I think it acts as a really useful relief valve. So when you've got people who are like, I really want to play with this new thing, great, scratch that itch on that side project. Don't do it on the mission critical thing we're trying to do for the corporation good here. Now, unfortunately, that's kind of fallen out of favor in a lot of circles, although I know more than a couple companies that do what they call Innovation Fridays, where they don't do billable work, they do open source projects, or they do their own personal side projects. And I realize that for a lot of us, that's just not going to happen. That's just too much of a commitment for a lot of corporations to give. But again, maybe we can take advantage of that Friday afternoon dead spot, maybe. Or maybe we can decide to do a Tuesday tech talk. Doesn't even have to be every Tuesday. But by the way, this is one of the filters I use. If one of my developers is like super excited, oh my God, we got to use this, like, hey, cool, can you put together a brown bag on that? You do a little lunch and learn? And if the reaction is, whoa, no, it's like, okay, well, probably not that excited about it, are you? Because if you're really pumped up about it, you will chomp at the bit. You're like, absolutely, can I do it today? It's like, no, let's get it on the calendar for later in the month. But yeah, absolutely. I'm also a big fan of architectural briefings. This is a friend of mine, Stu Holloway, came up with this idea. This is something they do at his company. And essentially what it boils down to is one person does a little bit of research, and then they present it back to the team. And I want to stress, you don't have to be an architect to do the presenting. Right? Titles are very interesting in this industry, but it basically boils down to, why should we use this thing? What do you need to know in order to answer that? What do you need to know in order to use it? And I want to stress, these should be short. This does not have to be a 3-hour marathon session. It can be a half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour at the top. This is not designed to be the deep dive how-to, but we do want to get beyond that initial kind of documentation. I want to stress these should be participatory events. Everybody should be taking notes. They should be asking good questions. You should be bringing your own experience to bear. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And by the way, you should be prepared to do one of these. It doesn't necessarily have to be next week. It could be next month. But this needs to become a habit. Now, if we get past the briefing filter, now we should probably roll up our sleeves, get our hands dirty, and do a little hands-on workshop. So let's carve out some time. Maybe it's a couple hours. Maybe it's a couple days. Let's walk through some exercises and figure out, does this make sense for us or not? We want to focus on how do we use it, have a very simple setup for people. Now, if we get past the hands-on filter, outstanding. Let's go do a trial. So let's find a real project somewhere in our organization. That's a good fit, I want to add. And let's see what happens when it encounters the real world. I was talking to a student I had in a workshop last week, and he was telling me that his company did this deep dive on various JavaScript frameworks, and they all kind of went off and did a spike, and they decided on one in particular, it doesn't matter which one. And then they started trying to do real work with it. And they realized that in their environment, with their use cases and their legacy code base, they kind of miscalculated. and they're kind of regretting that decision a little bit. It wasn't going to be just this drop-in as they expected. It all worked fine when you're just doing a spike outside of your own code base, but had they done a few real-world use cases in their code, they may have spotted that a little earlier instead of getting 6 months down the road and realizing, okay, we need to rethink that a bit. Now, I want to stress this probably shouldn't be your bet the company project. Now, the other side of this, of course, is currency. You know, we focus a lot on what's new, and we forget about the fact that maintenance is an ongoing proposition. And I think we're finally starting to grapple with the fact that staying current is something we should care about. You know, everybody's familiar with Heartbleed at this point. We all realize that thanks to Equifax, much of our data has been spread around the interwebs. Of course, Equifax has now been pushed aside. The largest hack ever is now Exactus, apparently, a company that probably most of us have never heard of. You know, I think at this point we should pretty much just accept that, yes, lots of our data happens to be, you know, in the hands of people we'd rather they not have it. Isn't that a bummer? Now, if you don't actually think your company is a target, there was this interactive map I saw, and I think they've since taken it down. It's probably a good thing because it'll keep you up at night, and it just shows all the real-world attacks that are happening, you know, in real time. And it's pretty frightening how much of that's going on. You know, you have to realize that the people, our adversaries, are velociraptors. They're just looking for an unlocked door. And, you know, of course, I don't know how they figured out how to open doors, but, you know, they did. And so we've got to be right every single time. They've only got to be right once, which is why my colleague Justin has been talking a lot about this 3 R's concept, you know, rotate, repave, repair. And it really kind of puts this on its edge. You know, our typical approach to this is, it works, don't touch it. Nobody breathe on it. We have uptime to keep. And then you realize that, wow, that's actually a bit of a mistake, isn't it? We need to move fast in order to stay safe. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he told me that at his organization, just their stock answer is, we destroy and recreate app instances hourly. Because that way, if someone happens to get a toehold, well, we blow it up. How far can you get in an hour? You know, I know some companies that basically repave their data center on Thursday. So they're always getting the latest and greatest. So we need to think about, like, what's our patching strategy? We need to think about, like, what version of things are we on? And I know that's hard. You know, I've been in organizations where we've had stated policies of N or N-1. The challenge, of course, is, do you measure it? And do you enforce it? I did a review a few years ago of an application, and I told them, I said, you guys realize that you're now N-3 on your JavaScript library, right? I said, what do you mean? I said, yeah, remember all those emails I sent over the last 3 months? No? Oh, okay, great. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that application is still running in production with what's now probably N-8 or something. I don't know. Now, honestly, that's a cultural problem. What do we have to change in our culture? And I get that that's hard. But what would you rather do? Change your patching strategy or become the latest, largest hack ever? That's the challenge that we face in this industry. And I was talking with my colleague Rohit earlier today about this. Culture is tough. I mean, culture is where good ideas go to die. You know, I don't know how we change that sometimes. It's the reality of this industry, though. So I'll leave you with that thought. We need to think strategically. We need to not just realize there's new stuff coming, but we need to understand that this is an ongoing process. And we have to think strategically about that. Well, folks, thank you so much for your time and attention. I will be around all week. Feel free to grab me and ask questions. Or, you know, again, I think there are Dead Trees versions of the books floating around. I believe that's correct. But yes, thank you so much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. Cheers.